Okay, I think now that we're all assembled, thank you very much for coming. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for coming today. I realize that this is the front end of a long weekend, which usually means that people take every opportunity to make themselves scarce, and so I'm glad that you're all here today to talk about this, the detention of Alexander Sodiqov, which is concerning all of us. First, let me thank the Monk School for supporting this event in particular. I also want to make sure to thank, in a very blanket way, because if I did it in any other way, it would take probably 2 hours, all of the people who are out there doing various kinds of things, having various conversations, working within their networks to work for Alexander's release, and I think that all of that is something that we'll be grateful for in the end. I'm Ed Schatz. I'm Alexander Sodiqov's PhD supervisor at the University of Toronto. This is all very personal for people at the U of T community, as most of the people in the room will already know. We're all deeply concerned for Alexander's fate, and that, of course, informs how we approach the kinds of things that we'll talk about today. But today's purpose, I want to stress, is analytical. The idea here is to do what scholars and analysts do best, which is to step back from events, no matter how concerning they are to us on a deep emotional, personal level, and to take stock of some of the things that are occurring, and to put them into a broader context and broader framework. It is a scholarly event, and I hope we can keep that kind of tone here. And you can see that there's evident concern on the part of scholars really globally. I mean, largely it's North America and Europe, but there's attention around the globe. I think you can see here that this is a part of a meeting or a series of events that are happening. The idea was that they would happen simultaneously. Some of them actually happened. The first one happened yesterday in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, at the American University of Central Asia, if I'm not mistaken. There will be other events next week in the University of Freiburg and then the University of Heidelberg. I think I've got that right. Nazarbayev University in Astana, Kazakhstan, also had an event, I believe, yesterday. Today, George Washington, University of Toronto, University of Exeter, and the University of London are all having events. And I think this is testimony to the sort of global resonance that this has for scholars, not just those who work on the kinds of topics that Alexander has begun in his young scholarly career to tackle, but also for scholars in general. And so there have been statements of support from places you might expect them, area studies associations of scholars, again, that focus on this part of the world, but also from the Geographers Association, what's that called? The American, anyway, somebody can fill me in there. Can't remember exactly, but the idea is that it's crossing disciplines, that there's a broad concern among scholars who do field work because it cuts to the core of what we care about when we think about free access to information and conducting our research in an atmosphere free of intimidation. Alex, I think, I know him well, as a young man and as a young scholar, young but already published scholar, I should say, I think would appreciate the approach that we'll be taking today. His own work, while very much motivated by a concern for the fate of Tajikistan, the country he loves so dearly, has always proceeded with great analytic rigor, precise conceptualization, and assiduous concern for using internationally established social science methodologies. And because he's a scholar, as I mentioned, this has had resonance with a number of scholarly associations. So you can check out I believe freealexsodiqov.org has this information about the scholarly associations that have signed some joint petitions, some individual petition statements of concern, and so on. There's a lot of resonance. Let me get at the front end just a bit of sort of headlines chasing out of the way, because I know that although this is not what scholars typically set out to do, this is something that changes minute by minute, and some of you will want to know what the latest is. And the latest is that not much has changed. That's the bottom line. Alex continues to be detained by the KGB. He's been detained, as you will know, no doubt, since the 16th of June, which is last Monday. In spite of some news reports that he's been charged with something, though always left unspecified, we have no confirmed evidence and no confirmed reports that he has in fact been charged. That's important to recognize. The family continues to work to get him an effective lawyer. The one provided by the state, and there is a state-provided lawyer, doesn't appear to be meeting the needs of the client. Right. And of course, in this kind of context where there is an atmosphere of intimidation, even if not concrete intimidation against particular individuals, it becomes particularly risky for a lawyer of substance to take up this kind of charge. So it gets complicated. On the good news ledger, side of the ledger, his wife reports having had the chance to visit him in detention, and this is quite good. And even better, she reports having seen no signs and been told of no signs of abuse while in detention. And I think that's particularly important, principally, of course, for Alex's well-being and safety. But the fact that he's being generally appears to be treated well, though he's in KGB detention in Tajikistan, is a reminder to us all that there are many good, professional, well-trained, progressive thinking and well-meaning people in Tajikistan, and some of them clearly work for the government. I think this is an important reminder that these contexts are not as monolithic as we tend to assume when we say read simplistic accounts in the media. Continuing on this sort of updates front, I understand, though I'm not representing U of T here, I'm a scholar and Alexander's PhD supervisor. U of T, I understand, is working closely with its counterparts at the University of Exeter. Alex, as you will know by now, was in Tajikistan. Though he's a U of T student, he was in Tajikistan working on behalf of a research project through the University of Exeter. And so my understanding is that the University of Toronto is working closely with the University of Exeter to make sure that everything that's possible to do is being done. There are various government-to-government efforts afoot, the details of which I don't know. But Canada, it's clear to me this much, Canada has been working with various other governments on the ground, in part because Canada does not have currently an embassy in Tajikistan, and so it has to rely on other governments on the ground, but also because these other governments do share this concern about this particular individual and generally about the issue of scholars facing these kinds of risks. As you no doubt know, there are various international NGO initiatives, human rights groups and so on, who are out there trying to secure Alexander's fair treatment, ultimately his release. And many of you in the room certainly will know that there's incredible grassroots mobilization, not exclusively, but I would say particularly among students at U of T, and it's remarkable and most welcome. I also mentioned the scholarly associations and networks. There's a lot of movement of people who are deeply concerned, but there's not much movement when we talk about the case itself and about Alexander's condition. Okay, a few things before we go forward, just about the format today. I mentioned the sort of tone I think that makes sense to adopt here is one of concern, but really analysis. I mean, our idea is to try to make sense of this event as scholars and as analysts. It falls to me to play the role of moderator, whatever that may look like going forward. About 10 minutes, I would say, for each speaker, just as sort of opening remarks to lead into the discussion. I will keep the introductions to a bare minimum just because we want to sort of keep our eye on the ball of Alexander Sodiqov. I think that makes good sense. After we hear from the various panelists, we will open it up to a broader discussion, questions from the audience, and so on. Now, I wanted to just briefly play a clip, if you don't mind. This is, I think, 47 seconds. This is from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Just to give you a sense, this is part of a much longer video, portions of which were heavily edited before it appeared on domestic television in Tajikistan, in Badakhshan province, where Alexander was initially detained before being moved to Dushanbe. And the reason I want to show it to you is that it shows the kind of poise that Alex actually is able to muster under what must be very difficult kinds of conditions. I don't want to show the whole thing because I would say at least the second half of it is heavily edited and seems to be designed to play into domestic politics and use Alexander to some of the reports suggest, discredit local actors within Tajikistan. But I want to show it to you just so you get a sense of what he's up to. And he's incredibly poised in this kind of thing, and he's very transparent about what he's doing, what he was doing in Tajikistan, how he came to this. This portion has been translated into English. The fuller thing is available in Russian. I'm told now that there is a full version with English translation dubbed on freealexsodiqov.org, but we'll just show a portion of it that's here. Okay.
Числа я позвонил утром Алиму Шахзамонову, мы с ним договорились о встрече. Встретились с ним в 11 часов в центральном парке Хорога, Чурбова. Я предложил пойти где-нибудь провести интервью, побеседовать в кафе. Он предложил посидеть в парке, так как сказал, что нет нигде поблизости нормального тихого кафе. Мы разговаривали, я задал ему в основном... Основной вопрос этого исследования заключается в том, что какую роль сыграло гражданское общество, неправительственные организации в урегулировании и предотвращении конфликта в Хороге после событий лета 2012 года. Мы говорили с ним на эту тему, он сказал, что неправительственные организации, гражданское общество сыграли позитивную роль.
Okay, so you get a sense of what it is. I mean, again, I would say probably the first half of that is unedited, if I'm estimating, but you get a sense that Alex really is being quite transparent, quite upfront about what he is doing. He literally has nothing to hide. We can talk more specifics about this later, but I think one of the nice things about the clip is it puts a face on this kind of issue. Okay, so let's turn to our panelists. I'm going to include myself among them, though I'll put myself second. First, I wanted to turn to a PhD candidate and friend of the family, a PhD candidate in political science at the University of Toronto, Igor Shoichenbrod. Did I get it right? Okay. We just met. He knows Alex in part because they are part of the same cohort, took at least one class as PhD students together, and they're both originally from Tajikistan. Igor left a little bit earlier, and so Igor says to me he looks forward to the promised authentic Tajik dinner that Alexander has offered upon his return from Tajikistan. So, Igor.
So, can everyone hear me? Okay. So I know Alex since 2011, which is when we both began our PhD program. So we met in one of those, departmental reception type events, and we immediately started talking about, Tajikistan's history and the fate of those who left Tajikistan when the Soviet Union collapsed. And so I was pleasantly surprised to learn first that he was from Dushanbe, Tajikistan, which is where I was born, and lived. My family lived there until the Soviet Union collapsed. What struck me most about Alex was his intellectual honesty, his scholarly rigor, and as well that he knew so much about Tajikistan's history, its culture, and its institutions, but not as someone who's looking in from the outside, but rather as someone who experienced those institutions, that history, and that culture, and therefore could speak intelligently about it. We also took, as Professor Schatz mentioned, the development core course together. And there, mainly what I want to say is I recall speaking to him, asking how he was doing in this course. And the first thing that he said, we were rushing to submit our assignments and everyone was really tired. He said, I didn't sleep, the whole night. And I asked him why. Well, he said his baby daughter, Erica, who was just born at the time, was teething, and him and his wife, they had to go to the hospital to make sure she was okay. And so what I want to point out is Alex, aside from being, a rising star, a scholar, was first and foremost a family man. And most in the department, my colleagues will attest to this, that he didn't spend that much time in the department as a whole. He spent most of his time with his family, with his wife and with their daughter. The other thing to point out is that one of the reasons why Alex would leave to Tajikistan during the summer, aside from his scholarly interest in the region, is because, well, as most graduate students know, our TA contracts end in April, and we have to make money for the remainder of the summer. And so Alex, aside from going for his own scholarly research, would go there, to provide for his family. And it's really important to point that out. The other thing I wanted to say is that it was a great surprise to me and a shock and really disappointing to hear of his arrest in Tajikistan, precisely because, he was doing scholarly research there, and precisely because he was providing for his family during the summer. As Professor Schatz mentioned, last time we spoke, he said, he invited me to an authentic Tajik dinner with his family, and also promised to bring me back a souvenir from Tajikistan. It's sort of like a pot called the kazan, which is used to cook pilaf, which is the national dish of Tajikistan, at least one of the national dishes of Tajikistan. So it's really, I was really taken aback when I heard that he was arrested in Tajikistan. All I want to say is that it's my sincere hope that he is released without delay, so that he can be reunited with his family, with his friends, and of course with his colleagues. We need more scholars like scholars of Tajikistan, like Alex, rather than less scholars of Tajikistan. And the other thing I wanted to point out is, of course, there are many resources that are available to learn more about Alex's case, but the graduate students have set up a website to which Professor Schatz has already made reference, freealexsodiqov.org. There you'll be able to find testimonies from his friends, from his colleagues, from faculty members in the department and elsewhere, attesting to who the kind of individual Alex is. And I seriously recommend, urge you to visit this website among others. So yeah, I think I should wrap up over there to give a chance to the other speakers to speak, and we can speak more during the discussion Q&A section.
Thanks very much. Again, the human concern is going to lie sort of at the base of everything we talk about here, though I think we're going to gradually pull the analytic lens out a little bit. I wanted to start myself with trying to, as a scholar of Central Asian politics, put this in the context of Central Asia and in the context of Tajikistani politics, and to ask what this says about authoritarianism in the region, maybe more broadly. And maybe there'll be some themes that can be picked up if people see fit. There are lots of ways to try to locate what has happened in the context of emerging and evolving politics in Tajikistan. One take, which I think is a really excellent source for quick background, is a nice piece by Joshua Kucera in the international version of the New York Times. I'm not sure what that means, the international version of the New York Times. I think everything is international these days, but oh, this is the old International Herald Tribune. Okay. But anyway, if you need that, I'm sure it wouldn't be too hard to find. It provides a great deal of very important background, and I'll touch on a few of the points that he's made and simplify quite dramatically. But some of the things I'll have to say have already appeared on the Monkey Cage blog. So if you've read that, this might be some repetition, but I think they're worth putting on the table for discussion. The context here is Tajikistan, as many of you will know, is a mountainous, incredibly poor, and poor in terms of immediately exploitable natural resources country emerging from the collapse of the Soviet Union. It emerges in the early 1990s as, unfortunately, for Tajiks, the site of civil war. That lasts, depending on how you count. These are always fraught questions for several years. Certainly by 1997, when there's a formal peace settlement, it is over. The civil war was brutal. It was violent, and it was traumatic. for Tajiks, and it continues to loom very large in people's imagination, and certainly is an important part of the way the government approaches trying to manage politics within this domestic context. The reality of the end of the civil war in Tajikistan is that they simply papered over a number of grievances that were quite important in driving some of the original dynamics. And one could talk about this in greater depth, but there were lots of unresolved and perhaps unresolvable, given the pressing imperative to simply end the violence. But there were lots of grievances that simply remained papered over. Today, in fact, 27th of June, it's already tomorrow, I think, in Tajikistan. Today is National Unity Day, and this is, in fact, the day when Tajiks are to celebrate the fact of national unity, to think about ways to ensure national unity, and again, in order to avoid the kinds of violence and trauma and difficulties experienced during the Civil War period. So, congratulations to all Tajiks on National Unity Day. This is the context, though, and I think this actually matters quite a bit, as you'll see going forward. Fast forwarding just a little bit, the regime of President Rahman seems to claim credit for ending the Civil War, for providing the kind of stability I would characterize it as a pretty precarious stability, but nonetheless, there hasn't been a return to widespread violence, and some degree of macroeconomic growth. And he does claim credit, and the regime claims credit. I think that close relations with the U.S. and the West in general during the global war on terror, and especially the campaign in Afghanistan, might have had something to do with the stability that we saw there over the past decade. But nonetheless, credit is being claimed, and the regime has increasingly grown bold with respect to some of the regions of the country that were not entirely in the fold of the national project, and we're de facto really not under the control of the central authorities. So there are much that could be said, but particularly in the Rasht Valley and in the Badakhshan province, the latter is where Alex was initially detained. Badakhshan has a long border with Afghanistan. These have been the sites of violence between central security forces and local actors, and they each have their own dynamics. The details are sometimes difficult to discern, but nonetheless, it's clear that this is really an issue between sort of center and periphery, as we political scientists like to talk about. So like Vladimir Putin in Russia, Rahman appears more than willing to build a strong state on authoritarian foundations. Yeah, he envisions himself as sort of Bismarck of Tajikistan. Switching to another metaphor, as Stalin's secret police chief commented during the Great Purges in the late 30s, when you, quote, when you chop wood, chips fly, unquote. And the chips have flown. So over the past couple of years, we've seen stepped up pressure on journalists. This has always been present to some degree, but it's gotten more marked. Opposition parties gradually were being marginalized over the course of a decade, but over the past couple of years have lost all meaningful political representation. Pressures on religious groups and ordinary pious Muslims has been ratcheted up. And in general, the security and surveillance apparatus closely monitors the public's activities and increasingly, though selectively, appears willing to take action. So Alexander Sodiqov, this is where he enters into the picture. He had the misfortune of being a scholar interested in conflict and conflict prevention in Badakhshan at a time when the security services were particularly sensitive about their inability to establish any kind of authority in the Badakhshan province. So Alexander was asking questions about conflict that the security services apparently thought dangerous to ask. Alexander was asking questions, and I want to emphasize that any student of politics would want to ask in the course of a normal research project. And previously, scholars had been untouched in Tajikistan, and certainly those who've been trained in foreign universities had been entirely untouched. It was really journalists who encountered these kinds of pressures and faced these kinds of risks. Scholars had been largely left to their own devices, on the, I think, fairly reasonable notion that who cares what a scholar says? Let me say that this case reveals some key aspects of some key facets of authoritarianism in this part of the world. First thing, and I alluded to it already, is that these regimes are not monolithic. That's really important here, and if you study what's happened over the past 11 days now closely, it just sort of reiterates and underscores what scholars of authoritarianism have come to learn over the past decade. And Luke and Wei and other people have talked a lot about this, that there are different interests within the regime, even though we might be tempted to broad brush it all as authoritarian. In this particular case, the security services seem to have been acting on their own initiative and seem to have got themselves into, invested themselves into a particular kind of outcome that they thought that the rest of the regime would buy into. But it's not clear that everyone shares the sensibilities of the security services. Others in the government have publicly expressed some degree of sympathy, or at least left the door open to conversations with their Western counterparts. And I think that's really crucially important for people in the West to realize here, that this is not a monolithic regime. Second thing is, although authoritarianism is authoritarianism, there's no way to sort of sugarcoat it. Tajikistan is not North Korea, right? There are some key differences here. Let me just talk briefly about the news media. The news media in Tajikistan is clearly government managed, and it doesn't take very long of reading this stuff to if you didn't know already, to make that clear. But that's not the same thing as it being government controlled. And in fact, global advocates for scholarly freedom, and they've all come to use their resourcefulness and use their energies in this particular case over the past 11 days, have found many media outlets within Tajikistan, local media outlets, quite willing to publish articles that are at least depicting Alexander for what he is, which is a scholar, right? Of course, then there's the government media, which is offering a different kind of story. But the key point here is that there is some oxygen that exists for free expression in such environments. Third thing is that the dynamics of these kinds of cases, which you might call human rights cases, vary from context to context. So, Russia, China, and Iran are able to push back against international campaigns to protect rights on the ground, and that has to do with all sorts of, issues about, the architecture of global politics we could talk about. But the ongoing advocacy for, in the Alexander's case, points to the fact that many human rights abuses, it reminds us that many human rights abuses are committed in smaller states that would rather not assume the reputational risks involved in alienating the global community. This is just something they'd rather not do, and they're trying to find ways to extricate themselves from this kind of predicament they find themselves in. Aid-dependent states cannot simply thumb their noses at their international obligations. It's not that simple. And so when the Tajik foreign minister visits the UK next week, he's likely to get an earful from a bunch of people who've taken to this case with serious concern. And one hopes that the member states of the OSCE, which have been meeting in Vienna, I think their meeting last meeting ends today, are also bringing up the case. It's not clear to me if they have, but one can hope that they have done so. Final thing about these regimes. These regimes seem to believe that since they manage their own domestic information environments, that all it really takes to get the political upper hand is to advance and propagate their own preferred narrative of events. And it kind of works. It kind of works. This is a region where geopolitical intrigue is a staple of local media coverage. And regimes just sort of assume that people will believe such narratives, or at least suspend their disbelief. Now, the reality, though, I think is more complicated, and these regimes, I think, are coming around to understanding this, maybe slowly, but hopefully surely. Central Asians can be told what to think, but a preposterous story propagated without evidence is not going to convince anyone. So government media outlets have propagated this crude story that Sodiqov is a spy. No evidence is provided, and if they had evidence, they would probably keep it for a trial if that were a meaningful sort of exercise. What they trot out in the media is just absolutely sort of bald speculation and the assumption that he must have been a spy because he visited with Brits and he attended a reception at the British Embassy. This is what constitutes the narrative, really, in the case of the regime. And I think that people see through that. Let me extend this point about Tajikistan to a broader point that I think concerns us all, and maybe if people feel like it, they can pick up on it. I was at a scholarly meeting recently when someone on a panel, this is a panel about the crisis in Ukraine, someone on the panel claimed that Russia Today, the sort of, what are we calling Russia Today, the media outlet? Let's just call it the Russian government media outlet. Russia Today, the person on the panel claimed that Russia Today's coverage of the bloody events in Ukraine were essentially the mirror image of CNN's coverage, implying a sort of symmetry and equality. To me, this served as a reminder that it's simply not the case that all accounts are equally plausible. I'm deeply concerned that the proliferation of accounts, enabled in part by the technologies that we all so love and have come to rely on and don't want to see go away in any way, seems to give license to those inclined to the fanciful and the dangerous. And in turn, the consumer of information simply chooses from a menu of narratives according to his or her prior sympathies. I would say that it's our job as scholars and analysts to help sift the convincing accounts from those that simply won't stand up to scrutiny. For me, the detention of Alexander Sodiqov cuts to the core of what we as research scholars do. We rigorously collect data, we analyze them, we disseminate knowledge. Sometimes the research questions we ask take us to places like Khorog, Tajikistan, where Alexander was initially detained. Sometimes the questions we ask might be uncomfortable for sitting political elites to hear. But it's hard, and I think it's troubling, to imagine a world where a passion for asking important intellectual questions and pursuing research about them is squelched. Such scholarly research deserves broad public support because producing valid knowledge requires it, not to mention the fact that the fate of people like Alexander Sodiqov hangs in the balance. Okay, thank you. Now I will turn to, Christia? Okay, let me introduce Christia Freeland. Thank you for coming today. I will keep it relatively short. As you no doubt know, Christia Freeland is the MP from Toronto Centre, from the Liberal Party. Pretty busy these days, so thank you again for taking your time to be with us today. Christia is not, can I call you Christia? Okay. I just did. Okay. Is no stranger, though, to the importance of knowledge, and she's been, a friend of the Academy for a long time. In addition to her BA from Harvard and her Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford, she has become an incredibly important analyst on authoritarianism, really, in, we'll call it this part of the world, broadly understood in sort of post-socialist context. And so she comes to this really as somebody who's very well informed about this part of the world, and we're just happy to have you today. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation to come and join you. I am really pleased and proud to be with you all here today, and I wanted to start by really thanking the University of Toronto academic community and the Monk Center for doing this. It's really, really important. And, I saw my friend and university classmate, your colleague Luke and Wei, laughing when Edward said that scholars don't count, don't matter so much, so that's why you guys haven't been subject to repression. I beg to differ. You matter very, very much. And, I'm so proud of the work the U of T does in the world, this international network that you're a part of, and the fact that the community is standing up for one of our own. It's especially important because, we've seen journalists, we've seen business people in the former Soviet space subject to this kind of repression. And when people from those communities, I'm thinking particularly about businessmen, both foreign and local, are persecuted, they have very wealthy institutions that can speak up for them. I'm thinking about the support that Mikhail Khodorkovsky was able to muster, even being Russian, even being in jail. the support that Bill Browder was able to build for his team. And I think that was great, and I was happy in a small way to support those efforts. But scholars don't have as much money. And it's really important that the institutions that they're part of stand up for them, because the work you do is really, really essential. Thanks everyone for being here, and I'm really proud and pleased to be with you. I think, as a Canadian member of Parliament, I feel a particular duty to be here, because one of the things I worry about in what feels to me an increasingly contentious, very much not end of history, post-1991 world, is I sometimes worry that essentially if you're not American, you may feel very exposed being out in the world. And I think that it's very important for Canada and for Canadians to be able to operate in the whole world. That's important for Canada. I think we have a lot to contribute to the world. But the world is, I think, an increasingly risky place. And for Canadians to do our jobs as scholars in this case, in the world, you need the support, we need the support of our government. And so it's great to have this grassroots university support, but at the end of the day, the government of Canada needs to stand up and be supportive. Now, I know that Alex is not a Canadian citizen, but he is a PhD student at the University of Toronto. He does live here, and his daughter is born here. And I think we have a real duty to him personally, and a broader duty to say to Canadians, please feel able to go out into the world. Your government will be behind you. So that's a reason that I'm glad really here. Now, to speak to some of the issues of authoritarianism and what's going on that Edward has addressed. I'm not an expert at all on Tajikistan, but I'd like to say a few things about what I think is happening more broadly in the region, and maybe with some particular reference to Ukraine. First of all, I think absolutely what we are seeing and what I think we're going to see more of is a narrative of these consolidating authoritarian regimes, which says any opposition to us and anyone who speaks up for an open society is an agent of the West and is seeking to overthrow our regime because that's the plan of the West. I was on a panel at Chatham House in London Wednesday night where we were talking about Ukraine, and sure enough, the Russian on the panel, Dmitry Trenin, and also one of the American scholars on the panel, both directly portrayed what had happened in Ukraine as having nothing to do with the agency of the Ukrainian people. It was all about, this was planned by the CIA and the CIA acted. And so I think everyone, journalists, scholars, business people, diplomats, not so much who come from the West, but who speak for an open society, are going to find themselves put into this narrative of, oh, so you must be a spy. You must be trying to undermine us. And it's really, really important as we write and speak and think about what's going on, again, as Edward was saying, to really push back against that narrative. And the words matter so much. It's really important, going back to the Ukrainian case, this sort of CIA narrative was reinforced by talking about Yanukovych fleeing the country as a coup. You're seeing it in this case with Alex being described as a spy. And it's really important to recognize what's going on, to be very clear in our own minds about the actual facts. Facts do exist and facts matter. And then, as part of this idea of narrative, I think really important to be clear about two other things. One is, and this is where I would double down on this understanding of a media company like Russia Today as, I wouldn't just call it Russian government media, I'd call it Russian government propaganda. It's important not to have moral equivalency. It's important not to say Russia Today is the same. And that can be hard, especially it can be hard for journalists, it can be really hard for scholars, because your training is to try to assess everything as being equal. But the reality is, it isn't. Some people, some media outlets are genuinely trying to establish the truth. Some people are actually government agents, and some people actually are citizens seeking to build civil society. Final point to make on the narrative point, which I think is so important, and I think in this case could become an issue too, is I think increasingly as we see these authoritarian regimes try to consolidate, I love that Stalin quote about chips flying, you know, chips are going to be flying, and one of the intellectual chips which is going to be flying is a notion that any form of civil society building, and so interesting to me that that's what Alex was researching, is going to be described as being foreign. Increasingly, there's going to be a story which says there's no domestic civil society, there's no domestic effort to do any of this. That's all somehow, you know, poison from the outside that is being pushed into our society. And I think as we think and write and talk about what's happening, it's so important for us not to take away agency from the people living there. That's part of the reason that I think Alex's research is so important, because that's exactly what he was studying. And certainly, again, not having very much knowledge about Tajikistan, but certainly in Ukraine, in Belarus, even in Russia, insofar as there is any opposition to the regime, it's all domestic. It's all about the domestic actors. Two other quick points. Why is this work important? I think it is important to step back and say, look, this is a really hard place to work. Tajikistan is a long way from Toronto. Why the heck are we, taking these risks? And my answer to that is it's extremely important, and actually becomes more important the harder it becomes. This is the kind of work that will be increasingly difficult for scholars who are based full-time in these countries to undertake. We've seen how hard it is for someone visiting from Canada. Imagine how hard it would be if you lived in Dushanbe full-time. And part of the duty of scholars is to try to keep as much of the world open as possible, open to study and open to ideas. So I think that this work is actually really at the heart of the academic mission of a university like the U of T, and I'm very proud that the university is doing that. Really important. And then a final point to conclude on a hopeful note. I think that Edward was absolutely right, and also in his really nice piece for Monkey Cage, to point out that the Tolstoy line about happy families are all alike, but unhappy families, happiness. You could probably say that about authoritarian regimes. Tajikistan is definitely an authoritarian regime, but it's not one size fits all. There are all kinds of varieties. And even authoritarian regimes, even Stalin's regime, are not monolithic. And I think there are some reasons to be hopeful. My particular reasons for hope are, first of all, and again, I'm going on the work of others, but it does sound, based on the work of scholars of Tajikistan and Central Asia, that this is a regime where there are lots of different actors inside the governing elite, and maybe not all of them were behind this and in favor of it. That's always hopeful. The second thing that I think in this particular case is a reason to be hopeful and something for us to work on is Tajikistan's a small country, and it's a country that has been a significant recipient of Western aid. And that's another reason that I think we can be hopeful that the right kind of pressure could lead to the right resolution in this case. That's all I had to say, and thank you for inviting me to be here.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Christiana. Very helpful. So now we're going to turn to our final panelist. I think he probably needs no introduction, but I do it anyway. Ron Diebert, thanks for being here. Ron is Professor of Political Science and Director of the Canada Centre for Global Security Studies and the Citizen Lab at the Monk School here at U of T. Ron.
Thanks, Ed, and thanks for having me on this panel. I'm glad to be here with all of you. And like Chrissy said, it's actually very heartwarming to see so many people turning out and all of this effort being made around the world. I really hope it has a positive outcome. And I'm going to say a bit about that at the end of my remarks as well, the significance of this. So when Ed asked me to come on the panel, we talked about having me describe a bit about our own experiences in terms of scholarship at risk through the vehicle of the Citizen Lab. I think we've had some interesting experiences over the years and have built up a kind of hard lessons learned. And I think what I'd like to do is talk a bit about some of those experiences and how we've dealt with them. And then turn to how I think things are actually getting a bit worse, not better. And so this is an issue that scholars as a whole are going to have to grapple with more often, in my opinion. And that leads us finally to thinking about, well, what do we do? So first of all, in terms of the Citizen Lab, for those of you who don't know, the Citizen Lab is an interdisciplinary research lab at the Monk School. Our main focus is on information controls. And by that we mean anything from national level content filtering or internet censorship to denial of service attacks on websites to the more spooky stuff like targeted malware or spyware attacks on human rights organizations. We've been doing it for a long time. The lab was founded in 2001. I think the focus of our research, information controls, and the topics that I just outlined, it's inherently risky scholarship. First of all, because information controls, when it comes to governments, typically tend to be undertaken by intelligence agencies, law enforcement, sometimes armed forces. So you're studying something that those agencies don't want revealed. And that puts you in a precarious position right off the bat. The other aspect of this is that most of the interesting questions that we have been asking over the last decade have been focused on countries in the global south, many of which are authoritarian regimes or non-democratic states, failed states, or even zones of conflict. So in order to do the research that we want to do and ask the questions that we want to have answers to, it takes us into some pretty unstable, risky environments. The other thing that concerns the methods that we use. I think this is really an issue that cuts to the core of why our scholarship is risky. So when we set out to do this project, I'm a political scientist, but I realized that there were a variety of methods, mostly used by computer scientists, system administrators, hackers, criminals, spies, that weren't being used for academic purposes. And so what I set out to do was to try to systematize some of these methods and bring them within the fold of serious scholarship, especially technical means of gathering data. So we developed, just to give one example, a software platform that an application that was used to test for internet censorship in countries. At one point, we ran these tests in more than 70 countries on an annual basis. And the idea here was the application would automatically check for accessibility to web content, and it would connect back to a database in the Citizen Lab, pull the list of URLs to check. A person in the country would simply press go, and it would automate the whole process, and the analysts would then review the results. Well, it sounds innocuous, but from the perspective of anyone inside one of those countries happening to look at internet traffic, what they're seeing is someone rapidly and in quick succession trying to access all of the radical, insurgent, Islamic, militant, pornographic, and banned opposition content in like 30 seconds. And then they're moving from one internet cafe to another internet cafe and doing this and so on. So, of course, ethical issues right from the very beginning, and a concern particularly with protecting the people who engage in the research of this sort was very high. Of course, the Act itself, not only that type, and that's just one method, there are many other methods that we use, technical interrogation methods inside countries that are analogous. The Act itself can be very easily reinterpreted in a plausible sense to look like this is a person engaging in espionage. So the charge of spying, and what Alex is doing, very traditional scholarship. What Citizen Lab researchers in our networks do can be really easily interpreted as espionage, because you're carrying an application that is connecting to networks, is checking all of these sites. You may be trying to document surveillance in the country. That's going to put you at risk. I said that we do research across the globe, and we've had many interesting experiences, including right up to the present day. So we're right now in the middle of doing research on Thailand. There's a coup in Thailand, and so as part of that coup, the regime is actually pulling in academics to try to quell dissent, and that's become an issue for some of the colleagues that we work with there. Last week, we released a report on Iraq. The Iraqi government, in an attempt to deal with the insurgency from ISIS, has put in place pretty extreme information controls, blocking all access to Twitter, Facebook, social media, and so on. We actually ran tests within the country, so think about this as in Iraq. It's a pretty dangerous place, and found that, in fact, the government, while blocking all those websites, was actually leaving the ISIS websites completely free. So you get some interesting results like that. We did a similar report last year in Somalia. So this is a country that hasn't had a functioning central government for many decades, and is pretty much governed by clans of insurgents. And so having somebody actually run tests in that context was something we really had to weigh carefully. We ended up undertaking some very limited tests from within the country, but I think it was worth it, because what we ended up showing was that there is internet censorship in Somalia, believe it or not, a country with very little internet connectivity, on every one of the major ISPs, and the censorship is done by a Canadian company called NetSweeper, which is based in Guelph, Ontario. Speaking of NetSweeper, we've had experience in Pakistan doing similar type of research, found same thing, that Canadian software is used in Pakistan to engage in filtering of all sorts of internet content. And those tests were undertaken by our partner in Pakistan, Shahzad Ahmad. Unfortunately, he's seen the direct consequence of that type of research in the threat environment in a place like Pakistan. He's had one staff member kidnapped and beaten, and the staff member was told that to send a message to Shahzad, they shouldn't be doing this type of research. He actually quit the organization. Shahzad himself had a news item broadcast on television where he was described as engaging in blasphemous conduct, which in a country like Pakistan is pretty much equivalent to a death sentence. And now we're arranging for him, doing the visa and paperwork and so on, to have him come to Canada as a scholar at risk. So another live issue out there for us. We've done a lot of research in this part of the world, in Central Asia, and that's probably where security issues are most acute. We've done testing in Tajikistan in the past. There, a big issue is not so much internet censorship as it is the type of incidents like what Alex is experiencing. So threats, intimidation, visits in the night by security forces and so on, and of course surveillance, which is something it's difficult to see because it's a hidden mechanism of information control and power. When all of your calls are being monitored and so on, you don't really know it's happening until you experience the consequence of it. Moving from Citizen Lab, I'd like to just say a couple of things of why I think the situation is going to get a lot worse rather than better. unfortunately. So if you do a survey of this area, I'm talking about information controls exercised by non-democratic states. Generally speaking, over the last decade, the numbers are increasing. Not only are they increasing, I think the governments themselves are getting more adept at how to exercise these controls. There's a learning process going on, as Lucan has described in his research, but a technical learning as well. Capabilities, products, and services are being put in the hands of policymakers that they never before imagined, like cell phone tracking, deep packet inspection, social media monitoring, and so on, which means that anybody engaging in the type of research that's likely to be provocative to those governments that are consolidating their rule is likely to be targeted or is at risk of being targeted. And the area itself is really, on one level you could talk about it as cyber warfare or cyber security, but what that really means in practice is control over the information space, including scholarship. And that's why I think we'll see more of this rather than less in the future. So what to do about it? Well, I'm really glad that we're gathered here and we've organized this event, and networks are being mobilized and raising issues about Alex himself, but also the threat that this presents to scholarship as a whole. I think the universities need to be much more proactive in terms of defining scholarship as something that needs to be protected as a human right, applying some kind of international humanitarian principle to scholarship in the same way that we consider physicians or medical assistants. We need to try to encourage the adoption of international norms, if not in practice, norms around the treatment of international scholars. There is a Scholars at Risk network that's based out of NYU that includes a number of universities. The University of Toronto is a part of that. I'm really glad to see Dean Sharp here, who's head of ethics here at the University of Toronto. Raphael Eskenazi, sorry, I butchered that, I'm sure, with Privacy Office as well. We've had actually a workshop together on ethics around cybersecurity research, and included within that some considerations around what I talked about. I think the last thing I'll say is we need to be, and we universities and scholars, much more proactive in terms of anticipating this type of thing, so that when the next time it happens, we've thought through from the ground up in terms of how we conduct ourselves as scholars to what do we do as a network of a community when one of us is in trouble like this, rather than doing it in an ad hoc manner when an incident comes up like this. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ron. Thanks, Igor. Thanks, Christia. What we're going to do is we'll have some questions. There's a microphone that will be circulating. I will recognize you. If I seem to have recognized you, you can be confident that you're on the list. So let's go ahead and start with Lucan Wei in the front. If you could identify yourself, that would be great.
Yes, Lucan Wei, University of Toronto professor. So a comment and a question. The comment is just building on what Ron was saying, that the importance of research for research's sake, and the importance of knowledge gaining for knowledge's sake. I think as someone who's researched in the region, one of the things that's very hard for people, especially in the security services, to understand is that you're actually just doing research because you want to know the answer, not because you have some larger geopolitical agenda. And I can tell you from doing research in Ukraine, when I was just trying to get the most innocuous information, which was social service provision by enterprises, which has zero strategic value. I taught the KGB or SBU figure in the Ministry of Statistics took me aside and interrogated me for 2 hours, because he was sure that I was working for the CIA. And I told him, no, I just want to find out the answer. And he was like, yeah, sure. Tell me why you're really here, right? And I think part of it, is just sort of an importance of an event like this is advertising the idea that, yes, we are just about research. And we just want to know, because I think, we're not sort of part of some grand American, Canadian master plan. That's one thing. The other thing is that I think it's important, there are two ways the university can react to this. One is that we can sort of immediately pull back, and I think as someone who has, graduate students working in very dangerous areas, my initial inclination is, okay, just, come home, right? And I think, that's understandable, and we have to be very careful. I also think I worry that we're about being too cautious, because I think, as Ron said, it's important to, and as Christia said, it's important to continue investigating these areas, and it will involve some risk. And the question is, you want to make it as I tell my children, there's a dangerous risk and a responsible risk. And I think we want to make it a responsible risk, but we don't want to go too far and basically, and making it impossible on our end for researchers to do this kind of research, because I think that would basically be playing into the hands of the autocrats. So that's my comment. Okay, my question actually is to Ed, is, having looked at what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, one of the things that always amazes me is that statements and claims that seem utterly ridiculous to us are believed by people. I mean, and as someone who comes from the United States, you can't be surprising. After all, no one believes in global warming, even though it seems utterly obvious. So my question is, what are the constituencies in Tajikistan of Rahman who are most likely to believe his narrative, and how big are they?
I'm going to try to process the question while I partially respond to one of your points in your comment. I think that linking a couple of things here, I think that it's very troubling when access to information becomes politicized in the kinds of ways that we're seeing here, but maybe that we're seeing globally, as Ron is starting to talk about. And I wouldn't say that any country around the globe is immune to the general trend, though we can talk about different scales of the trend in different contexts. That's hugely, hugely troubling, and maybe part of the answer does lie in some kind of, enshrining some kind of norm of access to information. It might not just be limited to scholars, but maybe that's the vehicle for that, for talking about it as a sort of a human right, something like that. That would be the long-term project, I suppose. I do worry about the potential chilling effect that this might have for universities. I really do. I think that and this is not just U of T. I mean, Alex was, under contract at the University of Exeter. This could have that effect at Exeter. It could have that effect in any other institution that sees its own students in this example. In other words, if they can imagine their own students going abroad, and they could say, well, now we've just got cold feet. And at least at the margins, maybe individual supervisors might start to counsel more caution. Understandable, but I think really problematic. I think really, really problematic. And I think that it's very important for us to figure out where we stand, because if we're standing for producing knowledge, that requires access to information. That means, by definition, not foreclosing interesting avenues of inquiry. That's otherwise we end up with a very partial and very limited knowledge in only certain areas that are deeply non-political. And I'll turn it over to others who want to comment on that. But let me just answer your question, if I can, if I think that I've gotten to the bottom of it, about essentially, do people believe? I mean, is there any reason to believe that Rahman's narrative in Tajikistan is bought? I think there are different ways to think about it. And on one end might be those who are inclined to say, okay, to ask the question as a binary, do people believe or do they not believe? Okay, and that's a useful sort of first cut. But I think it's more complicated than that in these kinds of contexts, because what does it mean to believe? I don't need to get too philosophical here, but do people need to believe, or simply can they suspend their disbelief? In other words, the threshold there is much lower. You can say, well, you know what, I'm not sure I know they're saying stuff, and I know I'm supposed to believe that, and as Lisa Wedeen talks about, I can act as if I believe it, and certain behaviors might follow because I'm acting as if I believe it. I don't really go so far as to think what my heart of hearts is really, how it really wants to grapple with this issue. I don't want to go down that avenue. Psychologically, it might be too difficult, and especially if you don't feel particularly efficacious, domestically. So why let yourself, go down that route? And I think the media and again, I want to emphasize the plurality of media in these kinds of contexts. But if we're talking about, say, Soviet legacies, I mean, you see in the Russian context for sure, Sarah Oates has some great stuff on this, how the normal way for the media to interact with society and the normal expectation on the part of societal actors, individuals, about what the media does is different than what you get in the West, where we have this professionalized, highly trained journalists. The normal expectation is that the media leads. The media signals what the authorities prefer. Doesn't mean you have to buy it particularly, but the expectation of a sort of professional journalism is not particularly there. But I want to say it's uneven because there are media outlets, like I said, in Tajikistan and you've got some really dedicated, wonderful journalists who don't act according to that model. But I think the sort of modal expectation on the part of society is that, well, we know that they're going to say stuff, and so at least we're familiarizing ourselves with the preferred narrative. Anyway, much more could be said about that, but that's my take. I don't know if anybody wants to.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment a little bit more on Luke's point about responsible risk, and also Ron's comments around this about the university needing a policy and needing to really be thoughtful about it. And I totally agree with you guys. And what I would say is make sure to hold us, your elected officials, and your government to account, and make sure that we're part of it. So when it comes to Canadian foreign policy, our current government has very much identified supporting Canadian business abroad as a centerpiece of what Canadian diplomats should be doing. I think this is a real opportunity to identify at a real sort of high ideas level supporting intellectual work by Canadian academic institutions. And that it's very important that we do it. You guys are really, really good at it. We're living in a world increasingly where I think you're going to need some government support, or at least know that there is government support if something goes wrong. And I think that now is a moment when maybe we should be working together to formalize that as one of the jobs of Canadian foreign policy.
Okay, I have a list of people ready to ask questions. If you could keep your question and comments relatively short, please, yeah. If you could identify yourself, that'd be great.
Intellectual scholarship chill is something which is extremely important. But for me, the big complication is civil capacity, civil society development is messy and complicated. And the regions that one is working in, the people tend to be somewhat xenophobic for atavistic reasons, and their outreach may not be necessarily the most civilly ordained. So how can the university or intellectual knowledge-based system develop a coherent series of principles and ethos in terms of equipping the scholar going abroad, or when the scholar is, shall we say, engaged in internal matters, how does one provoke in a manner positive in terms of ensuring his or her freedom?
Yeah, I think that's at least part of the aim of why we're gathered here today, is to start to try to think some of that through. And I think it's important to point to existing institutions and projects that attempt to do that. So that I mentioned the Scholars at Risk Network is one that I know of. I don't know if there are others that are like that, but there's a whole retinue of things that they've developed around principles and practices and awareness raising, what to do in specific instances of emergency, and so on. I think it would also be useful to have governments like the Canadian government support, some kind of international principle on this. I was leading up to this event, I was trying to rack my brain. Is there actually international humanitarian law that specifically talks about the importance of protecting scholarship? I'm not sure about that, but it would be an interesting thing to work on, right, as a consequence of something like that. Of course, that wouldn't solve the problem, but at least you could point to it. And then when it comes to practices, I really think it's important to have workshops where scenarios are talked about. We, in Citizen Lab, within our network, we regularly self-examine our practices. We have scenarios around emergencies. So what if one of our scholars or network members is abducted and no one hears back from them? What do we do? Well, we actually do dry runs on that to try to talk through what our response would be. And I find that it's quite helpful. I think our research is a bit unusual, but you could do that sort of thing, you know, within a university community. Organization like the Monk School would be a perfect home for that sort of thing because we do international research. A lot of us do research in at-risk environments, zones of conflict. And so just having that routinized, I think, would be an important first step.
Okay, I just wanted to speak to Professor Wei's question. I think irrespective of what the people of Tajikistan actually think with respect to Rahman, I think the more credible information that's out there, the better. Because the people of Tajikistan have the internet as well, and to the best of my knowledge, that hasn't been restricted. And so I think there's been a lot of bad media, right? A lot of bad articles, both by Western newspapers and by information coming from Tajikistan. So the more information we have, the better, irrespective of what the narrative is there. And I think that's what we have to do. And that might speak to your question as well, in terms of what capacities there are. If there's very limited information, then there's very limited capacity, right? So the more information, the better, the more credible information. That's all I wanted to say.
Sorry, Jamie Levin, if you still want to. No, pass by. Okay. I've got Craig in the back. You could identify yourself, Craig.
I'm Craig Smith. I'm a PhD student in political science. One of the things that, like doing research abroad, I've never done research in Central Asia. I focus on Middle East and North Africa. And I've never done research in a country where there's not a travel advisory against going to the country from DFATE. What's DFATE called now? DFATE and Development? DFATE and Development? It seemed, I don't think that people who are doing this research are under any illusion that the Canadian government is going to come and save them if they're detained or if they get into trouble. And in the case of Palestine, you know, that was for a time the government's official policy that if you were there and you got into trouble, then it's your fault for being there. And it seems to me like even when you do an ethics review, when you're doing your ethics protocols, you're aware of the risks for yourself, and then you go off and do it. But something like this that shows that, that there's no institutional apparatus and things are ad hoc, like Professor Diebert was saying, it seems to me that I'm not sure if it's a partnership with the government that's needed here, if it's something that's broader, whether it's an international norm that's developed or whether it's an institutional capacity between universities or between scholarly associations that would be more effective. That's just a comment.
Let's bundle that with another question, comment. Elena, up here in the front. You could identify yourself.
Elena Yakovlev-Golani, I'm a research scholar. Yeah, okay. I have a question, as a mirror image of democratic peace. What we have in this area is an authoritarian peace. And I'm wondering if there are any attempts that have been made to try to cooperate or maybe involve to engage Russians and Chinese as, regional actors that might influence actually Tajikistan, and Tajikistan might be receptive to their suggestions. Thank you.
Okay. I will tackle that. Have there been any efforts? There are lots of efforts of various different kinds. What they amount to, what they specifically consist of, it's hard to know. Nothing has been publicly tried with regard to sort of, getting Chinese or Russian involvement. Doesn't mean that it's not happening. The Russians might have a certain credibility, but they might also have certain kinds of sympathies. The ability of the Russian secret services to penetrate post-Soviet space has just been increasing over the past decade, and so it's impossible to know. This is the nature of the beast about the degree of interpenetration, but there are plenty of stories about how the orders are at least being coordinated with people outside, so that the security services are basically on the same page. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. So it's hard to know what effect, bringing in a sort of powerhouse like Russia or China. China probably wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. Russia seems to be increasingly willing to be involved in its near abroad, but this may not be the case for them. About the authoritarian piece, I don't know. I guess I like it. It's catchy, but I don't think it's actually happening. I think that these authoritarian regimes actually have very different interests at the end of the day, and there's a particular moment we find ourselves in where those interests align. But there are some pretty fundamental, let's say, political economic disjunctures when you look at what China wants and what Russia wants and what maybe little Tajikistan wants. So if it's a peace, it's a pretty precarious peace, and I don't think it would last as long as we tend to describe the democratic peace as sort of lasting. Anyway, that's a much bigger conversation. It's a very good question to ask, I think. I wanted to briefly give my 2 cents on the question about ad hoc response. I think it's impossible to know ahead of time the specifics of somebody's entanglement. I mean, these are very unpredictable. I mean, this all went through the equivalent of our ethics review process at the University of Exeter. Yeah, no, I get it. It's not pejorative. But so it went through that. On the front end, there's a ton that we can do, and that we do as an institution to try to sensitize people. And Exeter had the same thing. These are increasingly globalized and shared. So the question then becomes, if and when the unpredictable happens, because it's unpredictable, then can there be anything other than an ad hoc response? And I don't know. I mean, I think I like your ideas about, and Ron's ideas about establishing certain kinds of norms and best practices, and there obviously has to be more sharing. But key aspects of this are going to be particular to this situation. So, for example, the U of T's response to this is developed in close coordination with Exeter because he was on the Exeter contract, right? That's a detail that matters quite a bit, and it's hard to prepare yourself in any systematic way for that particular dimension. So it doesn't mean that there shouldn't be a larger conversation to try to systematize it a little bit more, but there's going to be an element of ad hoc-edness no matter what. I would say. Anybody else?
Yeah, well, I would agree with Craig. I think implicit, if not explicit, in your question was what is the responsibility of the university, the academic institution, when these things do happen. And I think we have to have a serious conversation about this because it's really important for people like Alex, right, or whoever would find themselves in the situation. And if it could be done beforehand, all the better. But even once it does happen, and it happened, who's responsible? What can they do at this point in time? I think we have to have a serious conversation about that.
I saw Donna Orwin's hand. Donna.
Hi, I'm Donna Orwin. I'm chair of the Slavic department, and I have graduate students who get in harm's way. So I just want to make a couple, and I also just spent 2 weeks in Kazakhstan, in Almaty, not in Astana. So I want to make 2 points. One is, Lucan has left, but I'm going to disagree with him that what we do is not an agenda. I just whispered this to the graduate student next to me. We have an agenda. The agenda is truthful research. It's digging out the truth and so on. And that actually has to be defended to the world. It is not self-evident to human beings that the so-called objective search for truth is worth doing. And so we have to stop being ironic about that. And we have to start defending that. So what Ron's talking about, international norms and so on, but we also have to not just assume that it's something that people agree with. We have to make an argument. We can't just say, well, that is actually the Canadian-American agenda, is that kind of freedom to research things. So I think that's a very important point to make. My second point is that I want to congratulate Ed for having brought Alex to the University of Toronto in the first place. Because the question of how we're going to engage these countries and this kind of battle that's going on now, a very dangerous battle, is actually quite difficult to figure out. But one way to do it is to bring young people to our institutions, and with the hopes actually that they'll go back, or that they will, it's a way of educating them. So congratulations for doing that, and I wish the University of Toronto and other and governments recognized how important that was. But, and my final point is this, that, and I got this sense very much in Almaty when I was there. I talked to a lot of people, and Central Asia is a place that's very much in flux. So it was interesting to talk to the young people, the young scholars. They saw things very differently from the older ones, and they were already thinking about, how can I change things in an environment where I could get in a lot of trouble for doing it? So in other words, this is what's happened to Alex. He's gone back, he's taken the methods that we have taught him, and he's applied them, and now he's in jail. So I think that it's very important to also discuss, to be aware of how to operate in this kind of world, so that we can get done what we want to get done, but also keep people safe.
I think there's an interest in responding right away, so Christian?
Yeah, I just wanted to strongly agree, Donna, with your first point, that, you know, to stand up for pursuit of knowledge, that actually is an agenda in an authoritarian regime, and that's the and not only does it, you know, we really are standing for something when we do our work. It is also, in some very profound existential ways, threatening to an authoritarian regime. And so, you know, that's very, very different from, you know, a CIA planned coup against Yanukovych. But there's a reason why these regimes are threatened by the work that scholars do. And I think you're quite right that it's important to recognize that. It's important to understand that they're not, it's not a winnable argument with them to, and, you know, a reason that I'm here is I think it's important for all of us, including people outside the university, to really stand up for that and say, this is an important community and collective value. And our university and our scholars doing this work, they're not just doing it for themselves. And they're doing it, it's even work that goes beyond the traditional aims of universities. So it's sort of, I think that yes, it's extremely valuable because the pursuit of knowledge is valuable, full stop. But it's valuable as well because doing it in societies, in regimes that are opposed to it, is a way of standing up for that value, and I think we need to.
Okay, I have Semra, yeah? Okay, please.
So my name is Semra Sevi, and I'm a MA student here at the Political Science Department as well. I think I want to agree with what Professor Diebert said with respect to universities being more proactive and anticipating these types of situations, but obviously it being a case-by-case situation of how they approach it. But I have a question for Christia. Craig left, but I think the point that he brought up was important, because if we look at the case of the journalists, the Al Jazeera journalists, at least one of them had a Canadian citizenship, right? A dual citizenship, Egyptian and Canadian. And I feel like he was sentenced to 7 years, I think 2 days ago. What was the role of the Canadian government with respect to that case, and what can we learn from that with respect to scholars being abroad? Because I definitely think that I'm glad that this discussion is happening with respect to what responsibilities the universities have. And I think because you raised the point of involving the government in some capacity, I think this is a question that needs to be talked about.
Sorry, and then maybe to Raphael, right? Okay.
So, thank you. That was a short travel for the microphone. My name is Rafael Eskenazi, and beside me is Dean Sharp. I do privacy for U of T. Dean works in the ethics area, and to his horror, I'm about to hand him the microphone. But we've developed a little one-pager on looking at risk of compelled disclosure, among other things, for researchers in preparing protocols. And Dean's approach, obviously, in the ethics area is very much about identifying risk early and figuring out what to do with it. And of course, Ron's description of running scenarios is, the paradigmatic application of that approach. And I think that has to be the approach for researchers and holding hands, obviously, with the research ethics boards in order to identify as early as possible what might happen. And the researchers are going to be in the best possible position to understand the risks, agenda or not, but the reality is that you will understand better than anybody, again, holding hands with the REBs. But I would urge that there be more systematized ways of filtering and understanding risk. And what I'm going to ask Dean to do, if he wants, is to speak a little bit about our one-pager on compelled disclosure, which is mostly his creation. I just edited, but which I think is a nice little piece, which provides a basis for people to think about the risk and to structure their thinking.
Okay, thanks. So,
sorry.
It's all right. So, just to provide a little bit of context, any research involving human research participants, before actually undertaking the activity, researchers prepare a protocol, submit it for research ethics review by a research ethics board. And, here in the Canadian context, that includes social sciences and humanities research. So I work with the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Ethics Board. The different boards, the chairs of the boards, the managers of the boards, sit on another committee called Research Ethics Policy and Advisory Committee, REPAC. That also includes other members with, relevant expertise, like Raphael's expertise in privacy law, that sort of thing. So when we see recurring issues coming up again and again, we do what we can to try to put in place guidelines, especially where there's a lack of clarity in federal research ethics guidelines, for example. So one issue that we see a lot, I'd say, maybe 1 in 20 protocols goes to the full research ethics board as a relatively high risk kind of undertaking. Of those, maybe half of any given agenda, I think, can reasonably be understood as research, where there's a reasonably foreseeable possibility that there could be external pressure to disclose participant data. So that could be any kind of research involving criminality here in the Canadian context, of which we see quite a lot. It could be research set all over the world in different countries where you're doing research on, say, democratization or things that aren't illegal here but are illegal in other places, that kind of thing. So anyway, we've set up a one-pager that is available on our website. It's called Guidelines for Research Involving Possible External Pressure to Disclose Participant Data. Obviously, there's a dovetail between safety and field research and that issue. There's 2 separate due diligence procedures in place for those, so sometimes we'll refer researchers to the safety and field research due diligence process. But anyway, I won't say more unless people want me to. I've brought some of the one-pagers. I can put them out as a stack of handouts if people want to take them. The URL is long and complicated, unfortunately, but pardon. If you go to the VP Research website for U of T, there's a list of different kinds of guidelines, and one of them is the one that's called Research Involving Possible External, or Guidelines for Research Involving Possible External Pressure to Disclose Participant Data. Long title, but it says what it means. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Dean. I think that's really important and informative, and it's really nice to see that. I mean, I know that these procedures, are robust, and that you're sort of, as new things evolve and as situation evolves and the needs on the front end change, that you're developing new things. So I think that's key. Of course, I want to emphasize something that it's there anyway, but the risks are things to be anticipated, and we do all we can But in Alex's case, the risks changed on a dime, right? He found himself in something that was not something he could anticipate. I think that that's worth sort of emphasizing. It doesn't change anything we do on the front end. I don't think that, I mean, it's easy to look back and say, oh, well, these are all the things that came together which made it a risky place to go at that particular moment. But if I had been on the committee evaluating this project, what I know about this project, at that time, I would have said, yeah, this is perfectly, this is perfectly something that, this is research that should go forward. So now, of course, we know a little bit different. Ron?
Just a quick comment. It's something I'm glad Dean brought that up, because I've failed to mention one aspect of what we do in terms of preparation and advanced thinking is in terms of the equipment that researchers take with them. So, even as recently as 10 years ago, a field researcher might have had, just a basic tape recorder and pen and paper and that sort of thing. Now, just about everyone carries around with them a mobile phone or a laptop that, if seized, could reveal very sensitive information and networks of contacts. This is most acute for journalists in zones of conflict, but it also applies to researchers who are doing research in risky environments. So we've taken a number of steps that are just basic protocols now in the in the Citizen Lab around encrypting data. Very simple step that you could take: encrypt all your data, encrypt your hard drive. We have used applications when people are engaged in field research where they connect back to the lab. So there was one application that we used a while back where I could send a text message to somebody's phone and it would show me exactly where they are. And if they aren't where they were supposed to be, we had a kind of a kill switch on that so I could erase their phone. There's another application that just came out called Panic Button that's been developed for mostly activists, but it could be used by researchers where you send an alert and it goes out instantly. So these are things that are, because of the area that we work in, it's become now common practice. But it's the type of thing, unfortunately, that it has to be more widely disseminated.
About the Canadian-Egyptian Al Jazeera journalist, I do think that we should be speaking out and working as energetically as possible to support him. I think it's really, really important. And, going back to this issue of what should the role of government be, I think this is kind of a new area for us. I don't think it's really been thought through and worked out, but we have been very clear as a country that one of the jobs of our diplomats is to advocate for our businesses. That's very clearly now spelt out. It's one of their chief responsibilities now of our foreign embassies. What I am hearing from this conversation and concluding for myself is that we should work on and think it through. It's not going to be something that we come up with in an hour and a half about what should be the job of the government of Canada abroad supporting the intellectual work of Canadians. And certainly my strong inclination is to say, we're hearing from this case, there's a real need for it from, the scholars, and in the case of the Al Jazeera journalists, the journalists doing this work. And I can see a real national interest in supporting it. So I sort of take for myself as an agenda item coming from this conversation, let's work on that. Business has been very clear with the government and saying, we want you guys, we are taxpayers. It's in the national interest for you, the government, to support us. There's going to be a new federal riding called University Rosedale. Seems like that riding should have a voice in Ottawa and should be saying the university has interests. And those are very much dovetail with the broader national interest.
Universities and educational endeavor in general are part of the broader public sector in Canada. So and are perhaps more basic even than business, in the sense that they act as incubators and bring about positive business and research and development results. So in a sense, you would think that those would be protected first and foremost. Not that business doesn't also deserve some protection, but there you go.
Yeah, no, and it might be time for all of us here, who are sympathetic, to start really developing a clear case, because I think there's a danger that this seems either sort of following on from what Craig said, DFATE gave you an advisory not to go to this dangerous part of the world, or, a little bit ephemeral, abstract. Oh, some guy researching civil society in Tajikistan, is that in North Africa? Why? But you know what I'm saying, right? Where is the national interest as opposed to, the business case of increasing Canadian exports? But I think there is a really clear national interest, and I think let's make that case.
Okay, I have a list with 2 more people on it, and if you're still interested in asking your question, let's group these questions together. In the front, in the blue, if you could identify yourself.
My name is Sergio Golchuk. I'm a student at OEC, and I have more a comment than a question, because as we sit here and talk, we say, risky environment, not a risky environment, democratic, authoritarian environment, but none of us, except for you, mention about the culture of research, right? And the research culture that is present here in Canada is completely different from the research culture that is present in Tajikistan or in Ukraine. And being myself, native from Ukraine, come to Western academia, being trained in Western research methods, and going and conducting research in Ukraine using these methods, I see it's not working there, right? So we as scholars have to become these more creative research methodologies and be aware of that. And then coming back to the ethics office, right, which is also important. We cannot always implement ethics protocols in those environments, right? We can't always get the signatures that we are required to get in order to be ethical, and this should be also considered because we operate in different research environments and cultures, and we can't universalize Western research methods to all spheres.
That's why you learn language.
Sorry, Honor, in the pink there, yeah.
My name is Howard Edelman. I'm a professor emeritus of philosophy from York. I came largely out of interest and to get informed, but in background, I lost a student who was killed in Africa. And one of the effects, this is over a couple decades ago, he was actually murdered during doing his research because it was threatening to some people. And one of the effects, as a philosopher, I do international ethics, was to complicate the ethics of doing research. The procedures, and the last student mentioned it, if I go to interview Museveni, to ask him to give me a signature and agree to do the interview, it's silly. And a lot of the protocols developed in ethics, in the procedures, end up being self-destructive to scholarship. And I want to alert the emphasis of the ethics of ethics that creates certain problems. And what I want to suggest, since most of you come from political science, there's a politics about this. There's all kinds of ideas, not only on the prevention that can be used, but on the response, such as universities, whenever they do this kind of thing, universities respond by saying, we're going to assign and try to get, instead of one student doing research in this area, 100 students, putting the money and the students to back our claims and our cultural commitments to pursuing the truth. And I suggest that the politics of research, following your comment, is as far more important now than even the ethics. I think a lot of the ethics we've developed as an ethicist are overdeveloped and bureaucratized and interfere with good scholarship, and we need to do more politics.
Okay, we have just time for some last responses to this last round. I want to give Dean. You think you can keep it relatively short on this, because I think the ethics process here is has responded already to some of these issues. The microphone.
So I didn't go into the content of what's in the one-pager, but to be as brief as I can, one of the first points that it tries to make is that you want to be thinking very carefully about what kind of information that you actually need that would involve identifiers. So obviously a signature would be an identifier, and you would be, as a principle, trying to minimize how much identifiable information you're collecting. So routinely on many, many protocols that we see, we would be suggesting to the researcher or asking a question, do you really need a signature? In other words, there's no fascination with a signature as part of a consent process. So, and then there are many other identifiers as well, like Ron was talking about, having contact information on your cell phone. Those are all the kinds of issues that the guidelines are all about thinking through very carefully. How soon can you delink? Understanding that things like audio recordings can render individuals identifiable, that kind of thing. So that would be one piece of it. But yeah, there is no fascination with asking people to get signatures that would put them at risk. The point is to get rid of things like that. Okay, thanks.
Other panelists probably have time for just some quick responses to that last round, or any unsaid things that need to be said. I have one. So if you guys don't really want to, I want to actually partially sympathize with what you described in terms of the cultural differences coming from one place to another. And at the same time, partially dispute it. I mean, I understand that there are some key differences, and I see it, with people like Alexander when they come here. It can happen when people come from the United States to Canada. I mean, the cultural differences are there, and they're real, and you learn languages and so on. Okay, I'm an American who came from. It's difficult. It's okay. It's okay. Okay. So that's quite real and quite important. But I actually want to say it's much more complicated as well, because there are all sorts of ways by which people, say in Tajikistan in this particular case, are exposed to a lot of the same methodologies, questions about ethics, approaches to research that are common internationally, I would say, in the West principally. They may take on a slightly different accent in Europe and so on. But essentially, there are some common practices that I think people are exposed to. Open Society Institute, for example, runs a bunch of programs that bring people to summer schools to train them in these kinds of methods. It doesn't mean they deeply assimilate them or deeply understand them, but what it means is they become familiar with them. And so these are the kinds of initiatives that I think really help us to understand that we're talking about a transnational community of scholars, increasingly so. I think I'm going to try to see if I can make this end on a hopeful note, because I think that it's places like Tajikistan are going to have to make a choice. They're going to have to make a choice if they want to become North Korea and essentially seal themselves off from the rest of the world, or to try to do this kind of incredibly difficult balancing act where you manage in complicated ways the domestic environment, or open up. And I think that those of us who would rather see an open society in Tajikistan have reason to suspect that it'll be the third one in general. We hope that Alex will be, of course, released in this particular case. But I think the reason to believe that is precisely because of all these very transnational initiatives and the kinds of communities, scholars and others that are built around them. I've been in touch with a lot of people in Tajikistan through social media. Don't know how secure it was, Ron, but there you go. And there are a lot of people taking all sorts of risks in communicating with me, and quite openly, and mobilizing their resources. These are people of a different generation, and I think they have different sensibilities than the people, at least, than us older folks. I'll speak for myself. Thank you all for being here today. I encourage you to keep up both the sort of academic intellectual conversation and then the practical kinds of conversations about what might be done on all the dimensions that we've talked about today. So thank you very much.